Hello, everyone. Welcome. Um, for those returning, welcome back. To those new in the audience, welcome to Cultures of Energy 9, New Directions in Energy Humanities. And I'm really excited about this, our second session, which is a focus on publishing. I'm excited for many reasons that I'll mention as I make a few introductory remarks before getting the conversation going. It's my experience across fields, disciplines, historical periods, etc., that we conference all the time and have to publish, but we also don't talk enough about publishing, be it peer review, scholarly publishing, right? Or the many kinds of publishing that now cluster, sometimes ambiguously under phrases like public facing or public humanities. I say that not in opposition to those practices or phrases, I use them all the time, or in opposition to any of the new urgencies around writing and publishing, but with the hope that we can be part of an important aspect of a newer commitment, of a long-standing but also newer commitment in some ways to broadening access to university research. That commitment is to specify what we mean by public facing or the public humanities by thinking about the forms, genre, media, and audiences for the work that we do, and by working to always anchor that writing for, about whatever and for whomever in our invigorating research, right? And I'm excited to do that today in the context of environmental and energy humanities. It seems to me too that it's worth saying that the more we invoke our sort of newer publics, newer audiences, the more incumbent it is upon us to develop venues for exploring how to work with the forms, genre, media that open up these audiences. From my point of view, as a poet, as a scholar of Renaissance literature and theater, as an arts reviewer, and as someone attentive to energy and environmental humanities, I've always had to think about various audiences. But then again, so have most of us for various reasons in our careers. So we're doing new things in a way, but we're also kind of catching up with ourselves, making sure that our practices reflect the realities of what we actually do. It's why I've been excited this year, with the support of the Mellon Foundation funding, to work with a series of predoctoral fellows who are in the room today: Kevin MacDonnell, Bradley Johnson, Elliot Store, Clint Wilson, and the Diluvial Houston project manager, Sean Smith, for our recently, very recently launched site, Correspondences, a forum for the environment. All of these predoctoral fellows either have just or are on the way to very, very soon finishing their PhDs. So it's a measure of their work ethic and their persistence that we launched in a pandemic. And also, Sean worked tirelessly on the site itself, which was not easy, with the help of our great team in the humanities, John Waterhouse, Eric Granquist, and many others. So I can't thank them enough for helping us to launch. So in a way, this is a coming out party for the site, which is also a way of saying, hey, we're also looking for readers and writers of our new site. And as you'll hear, the site's organized around channels of interest that will rise and fall with the interests of our editors, writers, and readers. You'll find some links popping into the chat for those to come. But I also want to say very importantly, as we launched this site and as we thought about this together, we were really fortunate to have colleagues to rely on, though they may not have known that at the time, since these were not colleagues at that point that we really knew. We looked at a lot of sites as models or for inspiration, and we're so delighted today to visit with the creators and the editors and the maintainers of two really important energy and environmental humanities sites, EdgeEffects and Energy Humanities. So let me quickly introduce our two guests before we open things up. First, Addie Hopes, who is a PhD candidate in the English department and managing editor of EdgeEffects. And I love this, and it's from her own bio. When she's not writing a dissertation about documentary eco-poetry, she's thinking about queer and feminist approaches to mermaids and speculative multi-species worlds. She holds an MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College, CUNY. And I'll say, Addie, for a continued conversation later, I have a lot to say, especially after your last call at EdgeEffects for erasure poetry, a lot to talk about there. Also mermaids, but that's a whole nother story. So welcome, Addie. I'm so glad you're here in the conversation. And our other distinguished guest, Caleb Wellum, who is a research associate at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He writes and teaches about modern history, politics, and culture, and is the research manager of the Petrocultures Research Group. As a member of that group, he contributed to the collectively authored book after oil, and a recent project on the possibility of a solar future. He's now working on a book on the 1970s energy crisis in the United States. He's published quite widely, and Caleb has been involved in so many things. So I had seen his name around a lot before I had the occasion to be in contact with him for today. He's published a lot on the history of energy conservation, oil futures, car films, and the future of the humanities. He's an editor at Energy Humanities, and the link just populated in the chat, which is a sort of beautiful new site we're really excited to talk about today. So just the choreography from this point, in this order, sort of Addie and then Caleb and then the Correspondences team will each take about 10 minutes or so to talk about these sites. And after some crosstalk amongst the panelists from there, we'll just continue the conversation in a broader way with your thoughts and questions, which you're welcome to share in the Q&A functions. And we're, like I said, we're really excited to talk about this partly long-standing and partly new endeavor. What does it mean to write for broad publics about energy and environmental humanities? So from this point, let me turn it over to Addie.
I'm so excited to be here today to talk with you all about publishing and EdgeEffects. So thanks to the organizers for putting this panel together today. So I have been an editor with EdgeEffects for about 4 years, and I'm currently the outgoing managing editor. So I thought I'd start with just a brief introduction for folks who might not yet be familiar with what it is that we do at EdgeEffects. So EdgeEffects is a weekly digital magazine produced by graduate students in the Nelson Institute Center for Culture, History, and Environment, or CHE, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'll drop a link in the chat to make sure that everyone can see that. Great. So our name, EdgeEffects, borrows a word from ecology to reflect our commitment to publishing across boundaries and at the intersections of the sciences and the arts, the humanities, and importantly for today's conversation, at the intersection of the academy and larger publics, whatever it is that we mean by publics. We publish a wide variety of content: essays, creative nonfiction, interviews, field notes, reading recommendations, visual art, photo essays, and we also host a podcast, which is largely interviews with scholars and activists about new projects they're working on that tackle social, cultural, and environmental issues. So we really see ourselves as a space to showcase work primarily by graduate students and early career scholars and independent scholars and practitioners and other folks whose intellectual work is often at the margins of academic conversations. Because we are produced by a team of mostly volunteer graduate students, we have a really exciting ability to be very dynamic in the kinds of things that we publish. So the vision of the magazine shifts a little every year as the editorial board changes and as new editors bring in their expertise and their enthusiasms. So some years you'll see a real uptick in multi-species and animal studies work, and then there'll be food systems, and then there's just a lot of eco-poetry on the site because I'm there. So I can talk more about our process on that later if anyone is curious. So then I thought I'd give a little background on how the site came about. So EdgeEffects started in 2014 when a very small group of graduate students came to Bill Cronin, who was the director of the center at the time, and they said they just wanted to build a blog where CHE grads and faculty members could share their work in very short form and publicly accessible ways. And from the start, the feeling that it was really important to communicate their environmental research in effective and engaging, but also nuanced ways to interdisciplinary audiences, to students, and to people out in the community. That was always the driving force, sort of right from the start. While we're supported by a faculty advisor, EdgeEffects has always been entirely organized, designed, produced, and run by an editorial board of graduate students, which is headed by a graduate student who's elected as the managing editor. And that's one of the things that I love really most about our site, what I think differs a little from a lot of other publications. So early on, the magazine was mostly publishing work by people who are already on our campus community, who are already in CHE, or who were scholars who were visiting. That is absolutely no longer the case. We now solicit and invite pitches from people anywhere, and the magazine has grown a lot recently because of that in the past few years. So as we've grown, we've really challenged ourselves to think carefully and very intentionally about the conversations that we want to curate on the site. So for the past few years, a lot of our editorial energy has been spent on what we as a magazine, through the platform that we offer and through our editorial process, what we can offer people whose work is brilliant and so crucial to the future of the environmental humanities and the energy humanities and these conversations, but who might not identify as working within environmental questions or environmental disciplines as such. So a lot of this for us has been happening through our thematic series on the Plantationocene and Indigenous lands and waters. We have a new series, 2020 Visions, which is about imagining post-COVID worlds, and a new erasure poetry series, which is yet to be revealed, but should be really fun for us to put together. We actually just this morning published the final piece in the Plantationocene series, so I'll put a link to that series in the chat as well, because that was a few years running, that series, and we finally closed it this morning. So through that work, we've been really grateful for the opportunity to be publishing scholars and activists with backgrounds in Black studies and Indigenous studies and queer studies and disability studies and so many other fields whose approach to the environment differs very importantly and challenges and often offers critiques of more traditional environmental or environmentalist perspectives. And like the field of environmental humanities and energy humanities itself, we're constantly reevaluating and trying to be better about how we're framing this work. Recently, for example, we realized that our editorial schedule was reflecting our current board members' research interest, which is not in itself a problem, but it did mean that we were tending to privilege a lot of intellectual work from the global north. So as soon as we realized that, we set course to try to start remedying that and to open up what we are thinking about even more than we already had. One of the most satisfying things I think about working with the online publishing forum like EdgeFX is how contributors are so willing and excited to try new things as they translate the research from the genre of their discipline-specific scholarship into genres that are both interdisciplinary but also very public-facing. So we always want to honor the author's vision and the voice, but we of course discourage things like jargon or other habits of formal writing that can create barriers for readers. We ask for nuance and careful analysis, but we always want to make sure that it's easy enough to read on your smartphone while you're in line at the grocery store or whatever it is that you're doing. So I also think that what, and this came up in the introduction, that what any of us mean by publics or public facing is a constantly moving target. For example, recently, a number of us on the current editorial board are first generation college students. So we've been very interested lately in trying to publish pieces that will speak as much to our parents and our parents' friends as they will to our graduate student peers or to academics, to undergraduate students who we know read and teach the work that we put into the world. So we can't always do that so that we're simultaneously speaking to all audiences, but we can try. And that's some of the most exciting work that we've been exploring recently. So that's my introductory spiel, and I'm excited to talk more and hear more about all of these new projects.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for a really interesting event. I'm really excited to talk with other people working on similar kinds of projects because I'm, as you'll discover in a second, somewhat new to the online publishing world. So I'm the editor of energyhumanities.ca, or Energy Humanities. Sometimes we call it EH for short, as a signal to our Canadian roots. If you don't get that joke yet, if you don't get it by the end of the session, I'll explain it to you why EH is a Canadian thing. And I'll just give sort of a little historical narrative about how environmental or energy humanities came about, some of the things that we do, and a couple of things that I'm excited about, just to give you a sense of what the site is all about. I'm going to share my screen here so you can just see what I'm talking about. Does everyone see that okay? Yes, okay.
Looks good.
Great. So Energy Humanities is a much newer site than EdgeFX. We started around September 2020. It was the end of a postdoctoral fellowship at the time that I was doing with the Transitions in Energy, Culture, and Society program at the University of Alberta. And Imre Zaman, who was my supervisor there, approached myself and Mark Simpson with the idea of starting a blog about energy humanities issues. Imre was interested in bringing together academic and non-academic researchers, but also policymakers and other members of sort of the interested public to comment on current affairs out of their expertise, but for a broad audience. We wanted to bring energy and environmental humanities lenses to the world, what's going on as it unfolds around us in a sort of a broad way. So the site is funded by the Transitions in Energy, Culture, and Society program at the University of Alberta and by a Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada grant. And so Mark and I, with Imra's idea of the funding in place, we just started working without a whole lot of planning in September and October 2020. We wrote an introductory blog post and started inviting people to publish. For the purposes of Transitions in Energy, Culture, and Society, this is knowledge mobilization, which is a term that I don't love, but we hope that the site serves a number of different purposes for its writers and for its readers. So Energy Humanities is a pretty small operation. Imra worked with the designer to set up the initial design, a really excellent designer who gave us this beautiful, simple, easy to use web interface. We wanted to keep it as simple as possible, minimize distractions, make it easy to navigate to maximize readership. And with the understanding that web reading is inherently often distracted reading. So we're trying to mitigate that as well. So I edit the site with input for Imra and Mark. We're sort of a committee. We decide who to ask. Contributions are by invitation only at this point, pretty much. But we try to think about what's going on, who's doing new, interesting work, what voices haven't we heard from in energy and environmental humanities, and we invite people from different walks of academia, outside academia, and try to get them in conversation with each other. And so I do a lot of work with the authors once they've submitted their pieces to make the ideas as broadly accessible as possible. So to sort of publish in a genre that's different from the dissertation, the monograph, or the critical theory article to a much broader web audience. And we can talk about what that might mean perhaps in the discussion. I think there's still a fairly experimental feel to energy humanities. We're still figuring out the voice of the site. We're still tinkering with the design of the site, and we're strategizing ways to reach different publics. Because one thing I've noticed is that readership ebbs and flows depending on the network of the author who's publishing. And so it's a real challenge to get exposure to people who don't already have an established network that's going to retweet their post. So Energy Humanities focuses, our main mission is on publishing commentary on current events from leading thinkers in energy humanities and related fields, as well as interviews with influential and emerging voices working at the intersection of energy and society. Also short essays that introduce a new idea, a new project, or a new approach to understanding the social nature of environmental challenges. And we do this with the aim of making those ideas and those projects accessible to a community of readers beyond the academic research community. Over the past 8 months, we've published a number of current affairs pieces on COVID-19, throne speech in Canada, the Biden election. We have upcoming pieces on the Line 5 controversy on cryptocurrencies. We've had a number of really great articles by people who just finished their PhDs. I'm always impressed that having just defended, they're willing to write a piece for us about their project, introducing that project to a broader audience. And I think for those authors, it's a nice challenge to think differently about how they can articulate the main intervention or stakes of the project they've just defended. And also we've published what I consider a kind of reportage about what's going on in terms of energy and climate politics in other countries, in other regions. We've published stuff from people working in Kenya, Russia, India, and we have plans to further expand the voices and the places that we cover. And excitingly, we've been able to do some interesting interviews with more public figures. So we've had the leader of the Green Party of Canada sit down for an interview, one of the organizers of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we've got a few other interesting interviews in the works. And that's been a fun opportunity, I think, for those of us doing the interview to sort of test out and see where ideas from the energy humanities, where they might intersect or challenge the way that people in a more public political role are thinking about some of these issues. So those are that's the kind of things we've been publishing. One of the aims in the process for me as an editor is to make the process enjoyable for authors and for interviewees, to give people a chance to experiment with different genres, different kinds of writing, even different topics. So we want people to speak from their expertise, but maybe address something that they haven't written about before, whether it's the politics of COVID or the Biden election from someone who works on American literature. That can produce some really interesting insights. And I think it gives the writers an opportunity to stretch how they think about current affairs and how they think about their own writing voice and what's possible for them. And I think it gives the emerging researchers that we've published, I hope it gives them the confidence to write for a broader public, understand that humanities disciplines and humanities voices have a lot to say in a public policy sphere and a political sphere that's highly technocratic, run by data analytics and consulting firms, that the humanities have something extremely valuable to contribute to public discourse. In terms of features, I'm excited about. The interview series have been really fun to do for me personally. And I think in particular, we have the Helios series, which we just launched in May, which is a series that helps or gives researchers a chance to reflect on the practice of doing energy humanities research. So we started with Simon Arpana's Gasoline Dreams. This was an interview with a graphic artist and researcher who's publishing a book with Fordham University Press called Gasoline Dreams, Waking Up from Petroculture. And we interviewed Simon about the process of drawing the ideas of energy humanities researchers and bringing those to a broader public. And I think this is a great example of sort of drawing back the curtain on the process of research creation, and what kind of creative practices and struggles that go into energy humanities researchers, or energy humanities research. And I've also been, in terms of other pieces of writing that have excited me on the website, there's two that stand out. I mean, I love all the pieces that we published, but one is this piece by Claire Ravenscroft, which we had thought the site would be about really short op-ed style pieces, but Claire submitted this much longer piece. It was about 2,300 words when she submitted it, but it was so beautifully written and such a wonderful piece of critical journalism that we went ahead and published it pretty much at the length that she had submitted it at, and it was sort of expanded our sense of what the site could be. So we called it a feature, and I'm looking forward to doing other kinds of giving other researchers the opportunity to think about doing a kind of journalistic style piece on what's going on. And one other one that I'll just flag for your attention is this piece by Deepthi Swami. Deepthi is an engineer and researcher with the World Resources Institute in India. And this piece I'm particularly proud of because it was a good example of the ways in which the site is trying to bring together not just energy humanities researchers, but also people working in energy policy that come from different backgrounds. And Deepthi's expertise in the engineering challenges of a solar and wind energy transition are far deeper than I'm sure most humanities scholars. She works with this stuff on a day-to-day basis, and the way in which she was able to communicate and connect those technical challenges to the broader political challenges in a particular context in India was really inspiring and a nice example of the kinds of synergies that we're trying to create space for with the website. So I think that's all I'll say for now about the site. It still has this experimental feel. It's still changing and evolving as we go. It's still a very small team doing this work, but it's been exciting to watch it grow, and I'm excited for the discussion to follow.
All right, thanks so much, Caleb. Sean, let me turn it over to you for correspondences.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Smith, and I'm the managing editor for Correspondences, as Joe mentioned. I'll drop the link there in the chat if you're interested in checking it out. We envision Correspondences as an online platform for public-facing media, and as everyone said, we can have that conversation about what public. But we're focused pretty broadly on the environmental humanities. And we're based here at Rice, And we just launched our site just about a month ago, so there's a number of offerings, but we're adding more all the time. And one of the choices we made with Correspondences is to structure it around individual channels. And each of those channels are managed by their own editors, and each of those editors approaches the environmental humanities from their own perspective. And currently we have four of those channels. But sort of like Caleb was saying, this is still evolving, and we sort of imagine different channels to come online and become great. Have new channels get created, and while others are still being produced, but might also come offline. So it's sort of an ongoing way to present a number of different perspectives on the environmental humanities. And so now what I'm going to do is just turn it over to the individual editors of our current set of channels to discuss their own channels. And so first, I'm going to turn over to Bradley Johnson, who runs the channel What We're Reading.
Is it on me? Yeah. Hi, I'm Bradley Johnson. I'm a PhD candidate in the religion department at Rice, and I work on What We're Reading. So what we want here is just a place for different people to contribute reflections, more or less, and think pieces on books that they have recently found to be very impactful in their own research, for their own thinking, about all kinds of different environmental and ecological issues. This is not intensive peer-reviewed work that you would work on round after round for a journal or a book. This is very informal kind of writing, just to show other people ways that a book, either recent, like coming out within like the last year, or going back hundreds of years. If you find something useful from Jules Verne that's really helped you rethink some issues around the climate or ecology, we really encourage people to write on stuff that has been helpful for their thinking recently. We have a few pieces on the site already from PhD students here at Rice, Kelly McKisson and Bren Ram, writing on a couple of different novels, and the way that they sort of help us think about the looming idea of climate change and other catastrophes that are constantly in the background. And also a story about Kivalina, a village in Alaska that's had some legal issues with ExxonMobil, and even a court case that came up in the late aughts. So I really want to encourage you to come to the website. I just put in the chat there. And if you feel like contributing at all, I would very much encourage you to reach out to me. We're always looking for more people to write and give us their thoughts on different books. And I'll put my email in the chat as well, just so people know who to reach out to. So thank you all.
Up next, we have Kevin McDonald talking about his channel.
Hey, my name is Kevin MacDonell, and I'm the channel editor for Classroom Ecologies, which is a channel that's kind of focused on curating reflections on teaching in the environmental humanities classroom. As Joe mentioned, we're all admirers and readers of sites like EdgeFX and Energy Humanities, as well as sites like Yale's E360. And so, as he mentioned, we spent a lot of our early brainstorming sessions talking about what those sites do well, but also how we might kind of like dig out our own corner of the market, so to speak. And as many of you know, those conversations that have been curated on those sites have been and continue to be really rich. And so the question for us was like where we might add something new. And for me, I was really interested in seeing more content related to pedagogy. I don't know if this was spurred on by the transition to online and hybrid teaching over the past year, which I think forced a lot of us to evaluate and reevaluate not just what we were teaching, but how we were teaching. And so I was eager to hear more about how scholars in the energy and environmental humanities were thinking about their teaching. And that's not to say that this kind of content doesn't exist. In fact, just I think 2 days ago, Energy Humanities ran a really outstanding piece by Brent Bellamy, in which he discusses this kind of oil inventory assignment that he uses. So these conversations are happening, but I wanted classroom ecologies to be kind of singularly focused on participating and kind of curating these conversations. So for example, one of our first pieces is by Sarah Rich, who teaches at Coastal Carolina University. And she wrote a really fascinating essay. Actually, I'll share it here. She wrote a really fascinating essay on the experience of teaching Césaire's adaptation of The Tempest across several semesters, each of which was interrupted by an environmental disaster, from Hurricane Dorian to Hurricane Florence to the COVID-19 pandemic. And she does a really kind of wonderful job describing some of the assignments she used and how she navigated the intersections of the content she was teaching and the disasters that were unfolding. And so I think that's her essay is kind of emblematic of what we're hoping this channel becomes. And I'll just reiterate again, if you or anyone might be interested in contributing, I'm all ears. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Next, we have Elliot Store talking about his Cultures of Energy channel.
Hello, everybody. My name is Elliot Store. I'm an anthropologist at Rice and ethnographic field worker of environmentalism. Also, I guess I've been here for a while. I used to also work as a pre-doctoral fellow on the previous iteration of this channel, but it was the entire website. I'm sorry, this is just some small institutional local history. This is the old website, basically, and this has been sort of a continual question that I have, and an interesting one too. What do you sort of do with the old archive that's full and rich of stuff, but it's also a different project. So how does one, what can one use in that respect? So like I said, I think as we all know, websites have gone through and digital scholarly publication spheres has definitely increased since started 10 or whatever years ago. So that's one thing, but I think too, things are still quite uncertain about norms, basically, and I think that's good and bad. That there's a lot more experimental space open, of which I think my channel is trying to reach towards, but also how uncertainty is nowadays. So I think too, well, I got more to say, but in spirit of keeping it brief, I just want to highlight 2 posts I put up last night, and I'm just going to be incredibly proud of them because they're just masterful masterworks. The first is by Katie Ulrich, an anthropologist as well in my department, wrote a sugarcane list. Well, I just can't explain it too much. You just have to read them. And then the second one I'm also absolutely so proud of is by Annie Lowe in the English department. So this one's about her experience in our recent grid collapse in Texas. And she's coming to terms with Enron on the one hand and finance on the other hand, as well as not having lights on the other hand. And so that's a 3-parter. So keep on coming back for that one as well. Send us anything that you've been working on that might have to do with energy. And thank you to everybody, especially the authors. That's been the most fun for me, I think, too. Just getting to converse with these works, correspond to these works. Thank you.
Great, and finally we have our final channel editor, Clint Wilson, who runs our Toxic Times channel.
Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Clint Wilson. I just recently finished my PhD in the English department at Rice, feeling a little sentimental like Eliot, thinking about the many ways that SENS has evolved and the cultures of energy conference has evolved, been able to be part of these for at least, I think, 5 of the 9 or 4 of the 9. And so really did not imagine this is how we'd be doing it if you'd asked me, of course, 2 years ago, but also great to be together and thinking about a question that's really important to me, which is not just how we publish, but also how we write, and how that changes and how those are different categories, although that's a conversation for another time. My channel is called Toxic Times. I'm entering it into the chat. We have a piece as well that I really want to highly recommend, a piece called Toxic Pools by a scholar named Steve Mintz, who's at St. John's, and a really beautiful piece that I'm excited to have out there. One of the inspirations for this channel was work by Emily Rabbitoe, who's a creative writer who had, and I have a link for this too, I might as well share. This is How We Live Now. It was a year of brief reflections that she curated about climate change and living in an era of toxicity, global health, all these questions. And I wanted to model this channel a little bit after that, not daily reflections, but these sort of snapshots of what it means to live in this world now. And one of the things I like about the title, This Is How We Live Now, which I missed the we, This Is How We Live Now, is you can kind of imagine that you could put the emphasis on different words. Is it the this, the how, or the now? That's really the subject of interest for someone like Emily's work and for our work on the Correspondences site. And so we were trying to model it after that, trying to think a little bit more about how we could encourage people to send snapshots, little visions, little side piece kind of work, side hustles of writing that didn't fit into the normal scholarly, I guess, rhythms. And I've encouraged multimedia submissions. We've encouraged little selfie videos. I mean, whatever you think would be an appropriate form of weighing in on the lived reality of toxicity. And the reason I chose that, I'll say as a final note, is because my dissertation was on toxicity. And I'm not the first to point out that the word has, like the word waste and others, kind of spilled over its nominal or linguistic boundaries in all sorts of interesting ways. And so if we are at a point now where everything can kind of always already be toxic, then why not continue that work in the way we write about toxicity, thinking sort of more broadly. And I think Steve's piece does this really beautifully. So it was an honor to be part of this Diluvial project, to see this site through to its completion with the help mostly of Sean. So great work getting us there, and really an honor to be with all of you all today.
All right, thanks so much, Clint. What I want to do now is sort of open it up to a little bit of crosstalk, but also just sort of to ask a couple things. So we have someone who could be another panelist here. I'm so delighted to get some comments in from Melanie Dennis Unaru. She's started something that I'd like us to continue. If any of you have other sites that you're looking at, please put them in the Q&A. Panelists, of course, can do it directly in the chat, but if any of you in the audience, so I'm sharing The Goose, a journal of arts, environment, and culture in Canada, and I'm going to share a few others, and I'll share them as they come in. It's good for us to just look at each other's work and to kind of talk more about it. So thanks so much for that, Melanie, and perhaps next year if we do this again, we'll get you on the panel. That'd be great. But I also just want to kind of open it up, and just by noticing a few things that a number of you have sort of mentioned. How you work with different kinds of media content seems really interesting. I think it's our ambition to expand that. We've been sort of really writing based, which is great. I'm a writer, so I'm for that. But it'd be great to hear a little bit more about different kinds of media content. I think the labor questions are really important. It's really important to notice, and I know this from working with this great predoctoral team, it's a lot to do. And it's a lot when we're talking about PhD candidates and early career folk. It's also something really notable, which is thank you all for sort of really pushing forward and to really help push the field forward. But it's also a lot of work. It's a lot of work while doing a PhD and other sorts of things. The other last thing I just was thinking about, and again, please, anyone now on the kind of panel jump in. I'm a editor of issues of a journal we publish here at Rice, Studies in English Literature. I think a lot about the way scholarly journals have moved towards having a kind of open, semi or fully public-facing site that accompanies a journal. That's one kind of model. I was really interested to hear almost everyone say, well, we started with the idea, should we have a blog, and then moved into something, right, since we're all tired of even the word blog, but not the activities that show up on them. So it's really interesting to think about all the models of publishing you're talking about alongside the ones that we have been practicing and likelihood, in all likelihood, will still be practicing. In any case, there's just a number of thoughts, and I'm going to get to the chat so I can keep posting sites and things like that. But please, Caleb and Addie, jump on in along with the kind of Correspondences team.
I'll just say on the media question, we've started experimenting with doing, I don't know if filmed is the right word, webcam interviews that we've put on YouTube. And that is a challenge for a small site like ours because it is a lot of labor to produce those and to make them, to have the production values be worth the time to produce them. You know, if you're going to bring in someone really interesting who's really busy and has something to say, it can't be a video that sounds really awful or is poorly edited. So that's been a challenge. We're fortunate that we have this, the designer we've worked with also does some editing, but I think we'd like to do more media stuff, but there's also the time constraint to do it and to do it well. And I'm always concerned that things are as well done as possible, and that I think online things have to look, you have to have a certain level of design achievement in order to get attention from a larger audience, whether it's on YouTube or whether it's on the site itself. And so I think that's it's a significant challenge for launching a site like this, for maintaining it, keeping it current, because design is expensive and design requires a certain kind of expertise, but it's also really important to the success of a site, I think.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick just to second that. We've been thinking a lot at EdgeFX about the fact that we are digital and we are online and we can do things that just print can't do, which is really exciting. But a lot of us came into this, a lot of the editors on the board came into this with a specialization in print. So that's like what we're familiar with. That's what we write on our own. So our move has often been toward audio, toward podcast production. There has been some interest in the group to learn and to do research on their own to figure out how to make audio production work well and how can that work well on the site? How can we learn to make sure that sounds good, right? So that we're doing the best by the folks who are willing to speak with us and to publish with us. And so that's been fun. And then we'll have a few folks who get really wonderful and are so fantastic at their skills at doing audio work. And then they graduate and move on. And now we have a new crop of editors that come in the next year and we start training all over again. So we'll often have these sort of rocky patches where you'll see the new editors are training, and then audio might be a little less clean than it was in our past couple of months. So we're sort of moving on that academic calendar, trying to think about how can we do this best for the editors who are doing professionalization work. And it is, as mentioned, a lot of labor, but also how we can keep a kind of high standard of things that we know are interesting and exciting and sound good. Right? There's always interest to do other kinds of visual work. We end up running against some limits of our website because we use a WordPress platform, and a lot of us are not really great with coding. You know, we do what we can to make the site function and look a way that we like, but a lot of us, we do sort of hit a wall at what we're able to do in terms of the exciting ways in which a digital platform can make visual work and artwork really pop on the page. So we're learning and researching and trying in that same way.
I think what you're saying, Addie, I think it's a site like yours and like the Correspondences site to bring in PhD students and recent grads to do the work is a really great professionalization opportunity for the people doing that work, because those kinds of tech skills are in demand. It might be, part of your ticket to some kind of non-academic work that you may end up doing after your PhD. So I think that's another sort of bonus of these kinds of projects within, it's a way of rethinking graduate education in some ways, as opposed to just being a TA as your work as a PhD student. You might be an editor or work on coding. That's kind of exciting.
Yeah, I think the way Caleb put that, and to sort of go back to one of Joe's questions, right, it's also interesting to think about this in terms of sort of graduate student labor and learning, right? And for graduate students, I think I speak for all of us, so I say those things are always connected, right? Hopefully we can really learn from the kinds of labors we do, whether as TAs or as hosting a site like this. And, we've been fortunate at Correspondences to be able to draw on this Mellon grant that I think Joe mentioned in his introduction, to help us get that support, to help us free up graduate students from teaching responsibilities and other things to work on this site. But I was curious to hear about your guys' experience too about, how you get that labor, right? Because I think that's always a little bit of a struggle, right? I don't just mean necessarily either graduate student labor, but also university support. We've been fortunate at Rice to have a lot of support in the Humanities department. And, I guess as I'm talking, I'm just thinking about this great network of people we have behind us. And I was curious to hear how that works for your sites as well.
For energy humanities, it's grants that are beyond my purview, that fund the work, that pay me to do the work. So it's not volunteer on my part to do it. But for all of our authors, they're getting something by publishing something, but it is their free labor, especially for recent graduates or precariously employed PhDs. And that's something I think a lot about. I want to make sure that the time they spend working on a piece for us does something for them. I wish we could pay everyone who was submitting pieces, but we can't. But yeah, it's all Government of Canada grant money that makes this possible through transitions in energy, culture, and society, and through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada.
So finances is the thing that I spend a lot of my time thinking about and EdgeFX. We have always been really generously supported by the Center for the Culture, History, and Environment that runs the Nelson Institute, but we hadn't really needed, because we had an entirely volunteer board for most of our existence. We haven't had a huge budget because we weren't paying authors previously, and we weren't paying any editors previously. So really all we needed were operational costs for, hosting a website, right? And every once in a while getting a little support when something goes beyond my technological purview, right? But as we've grown and expanded, this question has become increasingly important to me, because my position as managing editor is now, it's a funded PA-ship. So that's very exciting, which means I don't have to be teaching or doing other work as well as managing the website, which is wonderful. All the other editors still work as volunteers, which there's a lot of professionalization and it's very exciting, but it is also a lot of labor. So this is one of the conversations that we continue to have. We've also been thinking a lot about what does it look like if we are going to try to be doing sort of anti-racist work or like anti-colonial work. What does it mean for us to be doing that and still asking everyone to write for free, as I think a lot of us do. So we were very, very fortunate this time around to have a little bit of extra money from the Nelson Institute to pay a small, very small, but to pay our contributors a little bit for the Imagining Post-COVID Worlds series, which we were really excited about, because then we felt a little bit better about reaching out to folks and asking them to write for us. Folks that are in other kinds of precarious positions, or who, right, it's COVID, everyone's in a precarious position, right? So that was really exciting. And we're now just now starting to apply for our first grants. We had not been working on grants before. We just have a couple of new applications in, because we're trying to launch a new set of interviews or some podcasts that can bring in folks who are entirely outside of academia, folks who do maybe policy, lawyers, farmers, tribal leaders, folks who, if we are going to be asking them for their time, we would really like to be able to compensate them for their time, and to help us get a little bit better field equipment that we would need to be able to make these interviews work how we want them to. So, you know, we have some very big ideas that we're really excited about, but we do need those grants to make it work. And that's not something we've been doing before, because that's its own set of labor, right? And so finding sort of the time and the administrative support to make that happen is like next on our agenda. But a constant question, I think, is how to make the money work.
I pop in for one second quick to see, and I know I've got other, probably the correspondences team folk have things to say, but I'll just sort of say quickly something that I'm just brainstorming aloud too, because I'm learning so much. First off, thank you. Because I think about, you know, sort of mentoring this in the future, and the team coming in, some will stay on, some will go in, et cetera, et cetera. And we do have funding for now, right, for a few years, and we'll figure it out. But it's a lot to think about with the site. But I was also, so Rice is hosting something I mentioned in the first session. We're the institutional partner for the Society for Environmental Journalists in the spring, and I keep thinking, well, these kinds of sites might allow us, I mean, especially something as well developed as EdgeFX, which is what, 7 or 8 years now, if I recall correctly. It might allow us to sort of reach out to folk who could connect with a kind of publishing mechanism they might not have, you know, been on their radar, right? Which in the way peer-reviewed journals aren't so much, because that's because the hard work of journalism is different, right? Very often. So it seems like there are a lot of opportunities there. There's some great sites which are not, you know, core academic, but I'm thinking about Southerly, which is a really wonderful environmental journalism sort of for southeastern United States. There might be ways too that there's a kind of networking that can go on, which is really good for, you know, PhDs and professors and undergraduates as well. So just some thinking aloud. And I'd love to hear more reflections. I've learned a lot also about not just the kind of, again, I've seen the labor, involved as we've met, you know, every couple of weeks to sort of get this site launched, but also, you know, where should it interface with a PhD program? Like a TA-ship is one, or a, you know, kind of support for a managing editor, right? Which is more than warranted, right? Is it, how might it embed in courses or degree requirements? And I'd love to hear just folk all across the panel reflect on that, as I think with my department and other units in the humanities about what we think PhDs will look like in these years that unfold. So selfishly, I'm going to ask that.
I would love to see this kind of opportunity integrated into PhD programs in more places. I mean, my experience was fairly traditional. It was being a TA or being an instructor of some kind, the occasional RA-ship. But I think this is an equally valuable in terms of skills building and knowledge mobilization and thinking about your research and communicating. I mean, all those things are involved, and you get these in doing publishing. You get all kinds of other more technical skills you might not develop in graduate programs. So I think graduate education desperately needs to be modernized and is being modernized at a lot of different institutions. And this would be one way, not that every university needs to have its own journal of whatever they're paying graduate students to do, but this would be one way of doing that, of thinking about what the PhD is for students, what we're training people to do, what kinds of careers they might go into. You know, getting funding to pay PhD students to spend their time learning how to code for publishing, learning how to edit. Those seem like important things that graduate departments need to be thinking about. People have been talking about the job market for years, but particularly with the job market as it is, I don't know how department could not be thinking about other ways of employing their students and skilling their students.
Yeah, I know there's been conversations in other areas of the academic world about coding being a replacement for foreign language requirements. And while I'll at least say I'm agnostic, maybe I'm a little too traditional on that front, but rather than go that way with it, being more thoughtful about integrating these kinds of opportunities as part of the PhD And even honestly, Joe, you mentioned SEL, Studies in English Literature, even just having some sort of editorial requirement to the PhD, I think whether traditional or not, would be a really interesting thing in certain contexts. I'll just say my 2 years working as a copy editor for that journal transformed the way, not just the way I write, but also the way I source footnotes and double check things. And it was invaluable to me. And I would say that helping publish with SINS first, and now with Correspondences, similar. I realized the kinds of things that you don't think about as a writer until you're trying to format, not least of which being things like paragraph length or punchy topic sentences, which are more important than ever on a virtual platform. And so those are just some small examples, but again, I feel like a lot of times our academic conversations go toward the more extreme, like, hey, let's get rid of the foreign language requirement and do coding instead. Whereas instead there might actually be a number of more moderate integration methods that have not yet come to the fore.
So glad you raised questions about how to write. So one thing that I was just so lucky to get to rely on was that working with this group of the sort of first editors of the site, almost all had one kind of journal experience or another. And so the intent wasn't to just say, well, how can we kind of cram like a 30-page peer review article into 4 or 5 paragraphs, but rather, okay, how do we use all of those skills? But then think, and again, I've published quite a lot as an arts writer. So, okay, that's a totally different audience. That's thinking about, and Clint is exactly right, what's the right paragraph length? Or in a sense, what's the sort of scrollability, or what, I don't know what the term is, but right, how far will people scroll? How long should a piece be? And then to figure out not how that can be a cut down version of something else, but what is the thing that starts with these premises? A different way of understanding, yes, how some of the sentences work, sentence length, paragraph length, right? All of that. And then to build that, I mean, again, I'm a poet, so form is really important. And I'm agnostic about form in the sense that forms work for different occasions. And this is something that needs to be built into all the writing pedagogy at all levels of the profession, right? Which is that we are as flexible and as open as we can be as we try to make form and sort of form and genre and audience correlate, right? That's really what we do. And also, by the way, this is like a foundation in some ways of literary studies. We have these skills. We actually have what we need to make these big transformations. So Clint, thank you for reminding us about a lot of that.
Yeah, and I think these questions of genre and form and audience kind of circle back to this question of like who we're imagining our audiences to be, and who the public is, and the public humanities. And something Addie said when she was talking, I've been thinking about, and that was, she mentioned imagining her audience to be someone standing in the line at the grocery store, right? And what's interesting about that is that I think it's probably still an academic or a scholar of some kind who's the person standing in that line, but they're just kind of in a different context or in a kind of different headspace than when they read a monograph or a article or something like that. And so that's just something I've been thinking about, like this question of who the public is that we're referring to seems to me to be people kind of like us, academics in a sense, or intellectuals in a sense, but in kind of different contexts and in different spaces.
I think that's so important to recognize, because I know at EduFX, at least, that we like to, and I like to imagine that there is a sort of more general public set of viewers that at least some pieces will be reaching. I think I was saying before, some of us were thinking like, can my parents read this, right? Can my parents' friends read this on an issue that they might be interested in and find it something that's both engaging and accessible, right? And I do think that we use that as a guiding principle, but I think in reality, more than often what is happening is it is sort of folks in academia or academia adjacent who are reading things that are less formally written, right? Or like reading across disciplines, or sort of reading for fun, right? In these spaces, or to augment their more formal research. And that's been an interesting thing for us to grapple with, is like, who are we speaking to and what are we publishing? And is that going to speak to these folks? Kevin, you were thinking about the channel on pedagogies, right? On classrooms. And I think that is like so exciting. We actually have a project that we're trying to do, which is not at all about pedagogy, but it's about figuring out what of our pieces are teachable and finding a platform for folks that want to be using those as resources in the classroom. So clearly in that way, we are going to be speaking to people who are planning to teach, right? Even as we want to think that we're reaching to a public that is entirely outside of the academic sphere. And it's interesting to kind of balance those. And sometimes it feels like an impossible tension, but something that at least for me is important to have in mind as a possibility.
I think this cross-disciplinary question is so important. I mean, so many important things in what you just said, Addie, but the cross-disciplinary part of it is so interesting. I noticed myself, and it's partly through my teaching, it's partly through teaching a kind of core course in environmental studies with, you know, and I've been able to work with some of the folk in the room actually on that course in various ways. You know, this fall for Rice, these are big numbers. We're a small university, so, you know, 70 students from 26 different programs. And it's like, well, okay, how do you speak together? Oh, wait a minute, that's also a problem at the PhD level. It's also a problem at the faculty level. You could say problem or opportunity, right? Which is that some of what we call public facing writing is also about communicating across disciplines, which is, you know, that's actually a good thing. I mean, I don't, there's a way to take that as a disappointment, but I think that's actually a really good thing. The other thing that occurred to me, and again, I'd love to hear, Caleb, if you have thoughts about that too, about how disciplinary crossing happens in fields like environmental humanities or energy humanities, which are so multidisciplinary and need to be within the humanities and need to be in contact with so many other disciplines. The second thing that occurs to me too is that teaching gets us not just at what's happening at undergrad and grad level, but what kind of education is happening K through 12? I mean, maybe not K, but okay, well, no, why not? Sort of K through 12 with respect to environment and energy that we might want inflected with humanities and arts and architecture, interpretive social sciences. And what are the resources for that? And it seems like those are great. Those are both just great opportunities for the kinds of sites like these.
I think given the newness of our site, we haven't been as sophisticated in thinking about our audience, except to say that I'm always insisting on the piece have a point and make the point clearly, so that it's accessible to on the internet. Anyone could come across the piece. I find that when I sort of track the metrics, which I do sometimes for a given piece, depending on where in the world the piece is coming from, what the kind of network of the author, that can sort of attract all kinds of interest. And I have no idea if it's of just other academics or if it's people in the same discipline, or if I've got, you know, environmental engineers and literary scholars reading the same thing. So we just try to make things as broadly accessible as possible while still maintaining the integrity of the piece, the integrity of the ideas. Sometimes that means dialing back how to say it, the edge of a piece. Sometimes I'm trying to make, I don't want to alienate a particular readers with something that's written a certain way. So we're really just trying to take the ideas and make them broadly accessible. I think by commenting on current affairs, we've got an audience that's interested in current affairs, but also people interested in teaching in the context of what's going on in environment and climate. But I mean, all kinds of people happen across the site, and I want it to be intriguing to them to have this collection of writing that's there for them to explore. There's always that possibility. So yes, it probably is oftentimes other researchers, but I'm always hopeful that we're reaching people that we don't even know, might even be interested in what we're putting out.
Since it's related, I'm going to read a quick question. Either Caleb read this already in the Q&A, or there's a Canadian mind melt happening, which, you know, in the background. But this is from Imre. Hi, Imre, good to see you, or not to see you, but to hear from you, and more to come. Do you worry about metrics, such as measures of page views or time spent on the page? Does this help shape development of form or content in an ongoing way? Does it matter? Sean can answer maybe more of this. My first response is, have we found our metrics yet? We've just launched. So Addie is working on a site that's been around for 7 years, so she might have some other things to say. But also, probably it's of course the case that Sean and the other editors know more about this site than I do. So any of them who want to hop in too, please do so.
The short answer is not yet. I think it's something we've talked about doing, but honestly, we're new enough. We have been more interested in rolling out the content than measuring it. But yeah, hopefully Addie and Caleb can say a little bit more.
I mean, I do obsessively check metrics, but you know, I don't know. Does it matter? I don't know if it matters. I think it's helpful. I find it helpful when I can report back to the board to be thinking about what has resonated with our readers, right? And like in a few years ago, we really started finding that when we thought more carefully about headlines, right? Or like the decks that we were writing, that we would actually reach significantly more people. We're like, oh, right, headlines do matter in significant ways, right? And this is when we started the journalistic practice of writing our writing headlines. We don't use people's academic sort of, you know, colon, interesting phrase, colon, longer phrase titles that we get, but we sort of write our own headlines. And we found metrics allowed us to see how that really was resonating with folks. So we'd get views, right? We'd get clicks in those ways. But the most important measure is, do people stay and read? Right? Do people stay and read? And that's actually been really helpful for me in guiding how we approach some of the content on the site. Certainly not all of the content on the site. Sometimes we'll feel very deeply that something is important and should be out there, even if we think it might not resonate with all of our readers. That's also a way to build new audiences. Right? Maybe it will resonate with new audiences, and then maybe that will bring in new kinds of content that will allow us to reach more people, right? So it is useful, and it does help us make decisions about sort of forming and shaping how we're presenting the work to the world. It's not the only thing, but I do think it's useful for us anyway.
Just add on quickly, since there was another question about metrics and audiences that I missed earlier. Apologies to Mike Vessels. How do the metrics help you think about those target audiences? Is there information about that? But then also an interesting question about audience, the tension between preaching to the choir and addressing uninitiated, non-believer, outlier audiences. I love that formulation. So maybe I'll add that into the mix for Addie and for Caleb and all the other panelists.
I do follow the metrics, but the site is still only 7 or 8 months old. So for me, I think it's still learning about what goes in different places, what's popular, or what different parts of the world are reading a certain piece. Usually it's when the piece is written by someone from that part of the world, or when it's about that part of the world. For me, it's just a learning process. It doesn't affect at all what we publish so far. We publish what we think is important, what we think is interesting. We're trying to build an archive that people can come back to. So at this point, I'm not really at all concerned. I mean, I like to see things getting attention. It's a challenge to get attention sometimes because, as we all know, there's just so much online, and online reading is distracted reading most of the time. So I think that knowledge and seeing how long people spend on the site, seeing how many people actually click on the newsletter, that might encourage me to, get people to write clearly. I like to think more about headline writing, and when I'm writing a description of a piece, to make it, searchable. I hate the term search engine optimization, but that's something you have to think about if you want to be found online. So these are things that we're still learning about and thinking about. In terms of preaching to the choir, I don't know what other people think, but I absolutely do not want to preach to the choir at all. There's plenty of choir preaching on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. So I would like to be a more welcoming space. Not that doesn't mean not having a perspective or not being passionate about a point, not saying what you actually think, but yeah, I'd like to bring people into the ideas as much as possible, and see what happens from there.
On this theme, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Sean. I was just going to add really quickly to what Caleb was saying about preaching to the choir. I think this is one of the really kind of important kind of affordances of this kind of writing. And just as a brief anecdote, I wrote a dissertation chapter on the plantation, and when I was talking to my parents about it, I was trying to explain to them some concepts and things I was talking about with regards to the plantation I was seeing, and I used an EdgeEffects interview that was published a couple of years back between Donna Haraway and Anna Singh, to show my parents it was like a very legible explanation of some of the key kind of concepts that I was dealing with, right? And so I think that it just goes to show that this is why this kind of work is important, is because it's actually showing, it's actually giving the uninitiated, right, the kind of terms and kind of access to these conversations in ways that scholarly writing just doesn't really do.
Can I just say I love everything about that, Kevin? Thank you so much for sharing that. That's fantastic.
Sort of on the subject of metrics, I was curious how you guys thought about publishing schedules, because I think, Addie, you said you guys are weekly. For correspondences, we've taken more of we're trying to have a more even distribution of things across channels, not necessarily on a set schedule or to roll out everything at the same time. But I was just curious how you guys thought about that, and if you'd seen, those different strategies be successful in metrics.
I can speak quickly to that. We used to publish twice a week. For years, we published twice a week. And it was, I think, 2 years ago, I think we finally went down to one, which was this enormous relief for the editorial board. It was such an enormous relief because we were able to make sure that all of the work that we really want to make sure that all of the work that we're putting out, we're really proud of, right? And it's very difficult to do that twice a week and write a dissertation. It was very difficult to make that happen. So we went down to once a week, and we do publish weekly. And that actually didn't affect our metrics at all. We didn't get fewer clicks or fewer views. And as we started to think very carefully with a little bit more time that we had about the conversations that we were wanting to curate and about how we were presenting those, all of the time that was maybe going into publishing twice a week was now going into publishing once a week with a more thoughtful thinking about presentation. Our metrics have actually increased. Our viewership has consistently gone up, even with publishing less frequently.
Given the size of our team, we publish about 3 times a month. It'd be nice to be up to weekly. That's not always possible. But I've heard that intermittent reinforcement is something that Instagram uses to get people hooked. So it's a little less regular. That can also be exciting for people. No one is counting on their weekly Energy Humanities article yet. So if it comes every week and a half, that doesn't seem to affect our metrics yet either.
Caleb, since you brought up Instagram, I'd be interested, because a lot of the talk about metrics is making me think of social media and how social media is used to broadcast the kind of work that you're putting out. I know that, I know EdgeEffects, for example, has a sizable Twitter following. And so I'm sure that affects, it seems like that's one of the easiest ways to get content out and get people to see it, right? Rather than banking on them kind of typing it into their browser. And so I'm wondering if there is a social media strategy that you all use, or how you've kind of leveraged Twitter, Instagram, things like that thus far.
So we use Twitter to advertise things, and how effective that is often depends on the network of the author. So like this past week with Brent's piece, Brent has a really great network. I tweeted about it once, and the tweet had 3,000 views and so many, without any work at all. Other times I have to tweet 5 times once a day and get half the number of views. So it can be effective if I don't know that hashtags make much of a difference usually, but tapping into those networks, getting the right people to retweet things helps. We're thinking about purchasing Facebook advertisements, and Everything else is on Facebook, so why not Energy Humanities? But those, and then we use listservs and other kinds of networks like that to get the word out as much as possible. And we're hoping that over time, as we build an archive, that Google will start being our friend a little bit too. When you start publishing certain names and certain topics, we may come up in searches that way. So that's our strategy to date.
Caleb, I've also wondered about, have either of you experimented, or has anyone experimented with newsletters or sort of monthly roundup? I mean, I assume that's what you mean by listserv, but I don't know. I've often wondered if there's a kind of, I don't know, a sort of departmental email model that goes out to interdisciplinary, context.
Yeah, so we have an actual like old school listserv, the Petrocultures listserv that things go on to, and a couple others, cultural studies. And then we've started using MailChimp, where people can sign up on the website for MailChimp. It's not that large an audience yet. MailChimp also gives you all kinds of metrics. There's so many metrics that you can, who opens the email, how long do they look at the email, when do they click on it, how often they, etc. So I think that that does get us some views. I think it's important to have a function like that for people who are interested in being alerted, so they don't have to remember or happen across the tweet or whatever it may be. So MailChimp has been free for the size of audience we're reaching. I think it's free for under 10,000 subscribers, so you're probably good for a little while with MailChimp, and it's easy to use.
Yeah, I'll just sort of repeat the same thing. We have a list where you can subscribe on the website and you can be alerted when something new comes out. We do use social media. Facebook does give us more clicks than Twitter does most of the time, unless, as Caleb was saying, someone themselves, one of the authors or someone adjacent to the author has a big Twitter following, and then it can take off a life of its own just because of those existing networks. But we do have a Twitter following, and people do use that. Facebook does a little bit better for us. Yeah, and I think we get quite a few views just from folks like, clicking on what they subscribed, right? Just to see if they're interested in it for the day. Yeah, in terms of a kind of newsletter strategy, every year we want to do one. So maybe hearing it again will be the inspiration that we need. Every year we get very excited. We're like, we're going to start this. We're going to have a fancy newsletter. It's going to kind of round up. We're going to suggest other things that are from other magazines that are related to our content. And then we just don't have time, right? Then we just sort of lose the project as we are following the publication schedule, right? We just get wrapped up in the editorial work and we kind of lose that. But it's always a goal. It's right on the horizon. So maybe soon. Right.
So listen, we've got about 10 minutes left, and we can use as much or all of that time if we want. It's also a busy conference. So I just want to say right now, I'm going to ask a kind of final question of some of the panelists, but also keep posting in the Q&A or sites you want to kind of want us to share in chat of other sites that you're looking at. Because part of my goal is to think towards next year is what does an ongoing conversation look like? Again, for the students I work with, also for my own sake, I think editing and publishing conversations are so important. And also, how can we work together as different sites to really help reinforce what each other is doing? And again, selfishly from our point of view, learn a lot as we have been today. So both Caleb and Addie, you have both mentioned some things that you're already working on for the future. We've got some potential new channels coming in, maybe around environmental history, maybe something to go with what we're reading called What We're Seeing, right? That's more film and media oriented. We'll see. I'll also say my fantasy, and I just don't have time to run a channel, right? But I was thinking I would love video, sort of little video clips from people all over the world, just sharing where they are and what they're thinking about. We might move towards some things like that, but if not just in your next 6-month plan with a newsletter or something else, what's your sort of fantasy thing, something you'd really love to add or something you'd really love to see on your site or on another that you'd love to sort of read or see or think with?
I really love interviews with thinkers and artists. So I would like to be able to do more of that kind of thing for our site at a higher level. I think if you have a skilled interviewer and a willing participant, the interview is a really generative format. And we do have a great interview coming out that I can't say yet who it's with, but and there's a couple others that are in the works. And so that, I don't know, that kind of thing is really exciting to me, because you get this more kind of informal back and forth at a sort of human interaction you get to watch. So expanding the interviews for the website is one thing. And I've just listening to this conversation, I've got more ideas, but just the kinds of things you all are talking about that we hadn't really thought about that might be interesting to experiment with in different ways. But interviews and video in that way is something I'd like to see more of, but also with the caveat, like I said before, that I think it needs to be of a certain quality to be worth the time. And I'm also cognizant of not maybe pandering is not the right word, pandering too much. I know in educational circles, my wife works in sort of grade school education. All the teachers want to be on TikTok because that's where their students are. And I'm sure the students perceive that very differently than the teachers think they're being perceived. And so I'm also aware of not grasping too much to seem relevant. There's still a seriousness to what we're doing that we try to maintain with the site, while also being welcoming and hopefully lively and interesting as well.
One thing that I really love is folks that have roundtable conversations or have lots of voices respond to a similar question. I can put something in the chat here. Human and Nature does this really great sort of set of dialogues. So they have a single question, and then there are these sort of short snapshot responses. And Joe, I was thinking of even like having video clips or other sort of media that can be used to respond to that, creates a kind of roundtable conversation that is fit, I think, for a post-COVID kind of world where we're thinking about putting one another in conversation from lots of places. And we can continue that through something like the digital platform.
All right, if there are no other last thoughts, I'll say two things. One, well, let's see, three things. First of all, thank you all. This has been so incredibly useful for me. Again, to be selfish, this has just been really useful for me. Again, I've been thinking a lot about this with the really fantastic postdoctoral fellows that I got to work with this year, and I'm already thinking about it with the kind of the new crop kind of coming in. We're thinking a lot about grad education. We're thinking a lot about what we should be writing and publishing and how we are in conversation. It's the essence of what is scholarly, whether it's for a peer review audience or not. So I'm just very grateful for excellent conversation that is incredibly instructive to me. So thank you for that. That also includes our audience, who had sort of great things to say in the Q&A and that really shaped the conversation. One thing that did come in just in, and thanks to Emery again, which is, should we be using each other's networks, which I also take to be, well, what's next, right? And virtual might be a good format in the sense that I would love to get the funding to bring 20 public-facing sites together in one campus. I'm not sure that'll happen. And again, this is really running on kinds of sort of labor and affordances that are not necessarily going to afford that. But so maybe it is about some virtual networks, some conversations ongoing to help reinforce what one another does, to learn from what one another is up to, partly because it's really if there's always been what we now call public-facing writing, it has a new urgency and a new place and a new relationship to grad education and to publishing, and that's something we've got to keep track of. So I'll be thinking with my folk here and also with some of you about what we can do in the future, because I think that'd be really good for us all. And then just finally, I just want to say, we're sort of breaking now, but the final session, the third session of the day coming up, inspired by the channel that Bradley edits, what we're reading. And one of the things that we're reading right now is a sort of incredible and sort of important book by Dipesh Chakrabarty. So please join us for that. Sean's popped the link in there. And actually we were, again, I still don't know if it's possible to have something hot off of a digital press, but if it is, just this May, Dipesh Chakrabarty's new work, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, the title of which will remind you of some very influential essays of his that most of us have read. That's coming up at 3 p.m. Central Time. And we look forward to maybe seeing some of you there and seeing some of the rest of you in the future. Thanks so much to everybody. I really enjoyed this.